gonna put down that. So today, well, first of all, we only went over this quickly last time, so maybe we'll go over it again at some point, just very quickly. But if anyone remembers, name one type of neural net we discussed last class.
There was the recurrent neural net.
There you go. Who was that?
Nicholas Rose.
Cool. And can you explain what the basic concept behind the recurrent neural net is?
I believe that's the one where the each activation is based upon the previous time it ran through.
Very good. Yeah, so it's it's not the activation itself. It's the that's the basic idea though. It's basically one of its inputs is going to be the output of the last time.
Okay.
And you can actually change how far back it's able to look. So you could even make it one input that's from 2 times ago and one input that's from 3 times ago, and it gives us this sequential quality.
Mm-hmm.
Very useful neural net. We're going to be talking a lot more about those in their own little lecture, but
That'll be cool.
yeah.
Quick question. If it only took inputs from its previous activation, would it essentially just be a Markov chain that's needlessly complex? Or maybe not even needlessly complex?
I don't think it would be a Markov chain per se in that situation, but it would be very strange. It would be just so it would usually we start off when we're at t equals 0 basically in a sequence. We're feeding in some start token to it at the start. So it would get the start token, and then it would process the start token, and then that output would so it would I mean it could do something, it just couldn't really do anything useful. Like it would just output kind of garbage, I think. It's an interesting idea though.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so today we're talking about convnets. Pretty much any image processing you do, or any video processing, or anything that's even close to image processing, basically anything where you have this nice 2D grid here, is going to be using some form of convolutional neural nets. They're just really, really good at these sorts of things. And in fact, there's something now called a 1D convolution, and that can be used on text pretty well. It's not state of the art for text, but it is absolutely state of the art for images. So, why use these weird looking networks? Well, convolutional neural networks are basically, again, they're special neural nets that are made mainly for images, but they can also be used for video and other things. They use two special operations, and really only one of them actually matters that much. But they use two of them, and then they can use that to, in a way, deconstruct the image and understand the image more. And I'm using the term understand loosely here, but to understand the image more abstractly. And then from there, it can bring that down to a normal fully connected network that we've messed with before and do things like classification or segmentation or whatever. So these two operations are called convolution and pooling. But before we get into those, let's talk about why a normal neural network probably isn't going to do as well. Some of the problems with a normal neural network when it comes to images. So, a standard neural net, they're not super good at understanding these high-level features in images. It might be pretty good at figuring out that maybe an image has some, if an image has some pixels over here or over here in this specific area, that it is more likely to be part of a class. But it's not as good at understanding, okay, this is a picture of a bird and it's also a chicken. It's not going to understand these objects within images very well. And part of the reason that that's the case is that these neural networks aren't getting the full view of the image. What they can do is they have a flat vector of pixels, as you've seen in your lab. It's just one big long vector. It doesn't have 2 dimensions, it's just 1 dimension. And it can't factor in those relationships between pixels very easily. So it's not very good at understanding that a pixel, of the pixels to the above, below, left, right, and sides, and the diagonal sides of it are probably related in some way to the to what that actual pixel is going to represent. The other thing is that standard neural networks don't scale very well to the memory sizes that we're talking about when we use images. So let's look at both those problems. For scaling, we started with MNIST, right? MNIST is pretty good. It's pretty small images, 28 by 28 by 1. So we only have 784 inputs. That isn't all that much when we're talking about neural networks. It's a good number of floating points, but that's not that much. What if we use CIFAR10? CIFAR10 is one we're going to be using actually in our upcoming lab. And CIFAR10 has 32 by 32 by 3 images. The 3 at the end there, these are actually, can anyone guess what this dimension is?
An RGB.
Very good. Who is that?
Michael.
Very good. Yeah, so those are going to be our RGB values for every part of the image. And then the actual space that makes up the image is going to be this 32 by 32. But still, when you multiply all that together, you're ending up with 3,000 inputs now. You haven't increased the resolution of the image very much from that, but you still have a huge number of inputs. Well, let's go to something like a Facebook profile. You can see why something like that could be helpful for machine learning purposes if you're, trying to do some study on Facebook users or, stealing their data illegally. Whatever is you're trying for. In this case, we have these are standard 180 by 180 by 3 RGB images. Now we're at 97,000. We're almost at 100,000 just from that little increase in size there. And if you're talking about something like an RGB image that's 1024 by 1024, now we're getting to millions, 3 million in this case, inputs. That is not very efficient. That's going to lead to our neural network having a lot of pixels that it doesn't need, a lot of inputs that it doesn't need, and operating very slowly because of that. So the other thing is this flattened image idea. So if here I have a 14 by 14 pixel digit. I don't think it's actually that, but it's we're pretending it is. And the image that we get from that is going to be something like this. It's going to be these zeros and these ones that represents the shape of the image. And to be clear here, it's probably not going to be, because we have like gray in here at places, so it's probably going to be zeros and then like some 0.8s or something in there. But this is the vague thing we're getting. Now, even as a human, we're very easily able to figure out just from these numbers what this is supposed to represent. I mean, it's a 1 because you can see the 1s are all right here. and that would represent, you can almost just color them in, you know. But what happens if we flatten it? Now, from this perspective, it's very hard to tell that this would be anything at all. Yet still, neural nets are able to do it pretty well. They're that good at that kind of pattern recognition that they don't actually need to know that this number is related to this number off the bat. It can figure that out itself. That said, it gets a lot harder, and you have to operate with that neural net much more. You have to train it a lot harder to get that in very large images, or maybe images that aren't just zeros and ones, where you have different colors, different RGB values. The more options you have, the harder to find these relationships it's going to be. So, how do convnets fix these problems? Well, first of all, we're going to change our constraints a little. We're going to assume, before this, we've assumed that we can, when we talk about neural nets, that we're talking about neural nets applied to anything. You know, this could be images, this could be text data, this could be tabular data, whatever. We're going to assume for this that we're only talking about images here. And that means we can make some changes to the architecture. Instead of having one flat dimension, like we've had, where we just have a bunch of neurons all lined up, we're going to have we're going to assume a three-dimension system, like we had for those other images. We're going to have width, height, and depth. Depth in this case is just going to be our color channels. It's not actually going to be operated upon in a 3D way. We do have convolutional neural nets that can do that, but we're sticking with 2D for right now. So MNIST changes, instead of being 784, it's back to its 28 by 28 by 1. And again, this doesn't change our number of weights yet. This is just an important step we need to take. And therefore, if we want to going forward here, we can look at an image not as some graphical picture that we can see, but as a tensor with 3 dimensions. So we're going to talk about convolution first. And as you can see, we have this little graph here, or figure. And you can see that in some way data is flowing from this image to this series of somethings. They look a lot like images. And that is what convolutions are. So we're going to try to delve deeper into that. So a convolution is a neural network operation that preserves the spatial relationships between the pixels. So we're including the fact that pixels that are near each other are going to be more related than pixels that are far away. And we're going to do this by learning small sliding subtemperature of the image. So these subtemperatures are called filters. They are, or sometimes kernels or feature detectors. I'm going to call them filters. And they are going to move across the image in a certain way and act like a neuron unto themselves, basically. And they're going to go across the entire image. And these filters have weights, very much like a normal neuron. They're going to perform dot products and have an activation, just like a normal neuron. But the difference is, instead of taking the whole image at once, each one of these filters is going to take on part of the image at a time as it moves across. So those filters that move across are going to create something called a new image, a smaller image at all times. And this is going to be something called an activation map or a feature map. It's going to be an output from our convolution with one filter. So as it goes across, it's going to build this. and after it is finished going across, it will have one activation map. And then these activation maps are going to eventually learn to capture a certain pattern or feature that's inside the image. And we can, in a way, separate that pattern or use that pattern to separate from the image that particular feature. So that, I was talking very abstractly here, but let's take a look at how this works on the computer science level. Here we have a filter. It's going to be one single filter. And here are the weights we've given it. It has a 1 here, 1 here, 1 here, 1 here, 1 here, and on these various sides of it are going to be zeros. So it slides across 1 pixel at a time here. And as it does, it performs this dot product of adding the, or multiplying the weights and then adding them all together. And each of those is going to have one output. And each of those one outputs is going to finally create a new cell of this new feature map or activation map. Any questions on that? On the very basics of how it's doing that? Cool. So let's talk about why these filters work. Convolutions with filters are actually not something that's just from neural nets. This is not a new idea at all. And the field before neural nets came along, or before they got big anyways, the field of image detection and image recognition stuff had a lot to do with these convolutions already. Except instead of being these convolutions that a neural net are going to learn themselves, they would be a preset constant matrix that we slide across the image. For example, if you slid across a 3x3 matrix in which everything was 0 except for a 1, what you would end up at the end with is another exact copy of the image. So this is the identity function. Makes sense? There's also a few different ones we can use for edge detection. If we slide any of these 3 matrices across the image, it's going to produce these results, which are going to be a black and white image where the edges of various objects are going to be lit up in this with these with the white lines. And you can see in this particular image's case, this one seems to be the best, but I don't think that's always the case. You can also sharpen images. This is an attempt at that with this -1 surrounding a 5 matrix. You can do a box blur. You can do all of these different operations just by knowing the filter you need to use, and that's what computer vision was for a long time. Was coming up with these new ways of processing the image using filters and things like that. But for our convolutional neural net, it's going to learn what filter it needs. It's going to build its own tool for understanding the image, all on its own through our backpropagation. Which, by the way, we're not going to go super into the backpropagation of convolutional neural nets. It's very similar. It's pretty much the same thing. It's the same concept, but applied a little bit differently just to make it work with convolutional neural nets. Just know that it is basically the same sort of idea. We're still doing gradient descent. We still have a loss function. We're still changing the weights to minimize that loss function. The only difference is instead of doing a dot product of the whole x value, it's going to be dot products of filters. So,
sorry.
Oh, you're good.
I do have a question though.
Yep.
So are filters sort of like shaders in a way from computer graphics?
So I don't know shaders super well because I'm not a graphics guy, but from my understanding, shaders are small programs that run on the graphics card and uh, administer the graphics a bit. And if I'm correct in saying that, which again I might not be, then no. Filters, there's not really a programmatic element to them. Uh, they're simply a matrix that we're uh, by determining the elements of that matrix and the size of that matrix, we can do certain operations on the image. Some of them useful, some of them less useful. Um, but yeah, actually, Gustavo knows shaders better than I do. Gustavo, could you answer that question?
Yeah, they are not shaders. Shaders basically is a small program. It's a small program that you pass to the graphics driver. So that program is going to run by every graphical by every core that is in graphical processing unit to act for every pixel. Okay, so basically a shader is for processing is a small program. In this case, basically this is sometimes it's called a kernel. Like for example, the Max is showing in here. Like for example, if you want to, for example, blur the image, one way to do it is take the average of for every pixel, take the average of all the neighboring pixels, right, and obtain the average, and that is going to blur the image. Or for example, he shows also one for sharpening, right? That basically what it does is basically takes for every pixel, it looks around. It's going to look around and try to make the difference, and that is why you see the negative sign around it, and then a positive sign in the center. So take the difference between the pixel and the pixels that are surrounding that pixel. Now, the way the shader is going to be related to the filter is that a shader would be a very efficient way of implementing a filter. You see that? Because then basically in parallel, every shader can run, right? Can run and apply that filter for every pixel. If you just had a uniprocessor computer, or even if you have a computer with 12 processors, you could actually divide the screen in multiple in 12 sections and apply the filter individually. But yeah, a shader, if you have 1,000 GPUs, then that is going to be faster, right? So the way you can see it is these filters. The shader would be an efficient way to implement a filter, but this filter can be implemented also in a single processor computer. Does it make sense?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay.
Awesome. All right, so yeah, that's a great explanation of it that I could not have done. Kernels or these filters are basically just matrix that we're sliding across the image. But and yeah, the other thing is, while we can see that in a lot of image processing, we will actually need to know the values of these filters. When we're doing neural networks, we don't need to know them. They'll figure it out themselves. They're learning what filter to use based on our training. So that's the very basics of convolutionals. Let's talk about pooling. So this one is actually not a learning step at all. This doesn't learn anything about the image. What it does do is it tries to help and fix the problem of very large dimension sizes, very large numbers of inputs for these neural networks, especially in the internal layers. Basically, pooling is just a lossy compression. That's what it is, a really fast, really quick and dirty lossy compression on these images. And hopefully it will maintain the data we need and get rid of the data that we don't need. So There's lots of kinds of pooling. It's a very broad area of operations that could encapsulate a number of different things. But the important thing is it's always, always, always going to produce a smaller tensor. And that is important because we're trying to get less data. We're trying to compress our data down and not have to use as much. So a lot of the types that are used a lot are max pooling, average pooling, and sum pooling. In reality, for image processing, most of the time it's going to end up being max pooling. Gives the best results a lot of the time. And the hope here is the intuition behind that being the case is that higher value pixels will hold more important information. Is that true? Not so a lot of the time. Most of the time it is. It's, that's most of the time isn't the right word. A lot of the time it's not true. But enough of the time it's true that it's used most often when you're doing a pooling operation. And this is what that looks like. You're just going to take if you're doing a 2x2 max pool, for example, you are going to have, you're going to split the image into 2x2 cells, like so. And from each cell, you are going to take the maximum pixel value. In this case, we have 20. In this case, we have 30, 37 here, 112 here. And you are going to take each of these cells and make them be just 1 pixel by doing that max pool and saying the only one that matters from these 4 pixels is going to be the highest one. So, and that's all pooling is really. And if you wanted to do like sum pooling or something, sum pooling would just be, okay, this one would become 32 because we're summing all of these. This one would become 24, 32, 52. Yeah, 52, I think there. You just sum all of them, or you can average them. Averaging, it can be useful, but at the same time, it takes a little bit more time than just max operation does. It's not used very often. Usually, almost always, it's going to end up being max pool or no pooling at all. And that's actually something I should talk about. I don't know if we talk about it later. But the thing with pooling is it's kind of going away. It was very important in a lot of the early convolutional neural networks that were useful. And by early, again, I'm talking like 2011, so not that early, but like 9 years ago. And, it's still useful until the last few years or so. And now we're starting to get algorithms that still use these convolutions, but don't really need pooling. And some of them still do. We still have pooling. It's still something that's active and used in research and in the industry and all that. But we're definitely looking down towards a time when we're not going to have pooling anymore. So that is something that very well could be the case soon. Or at least we won't have it commonly. I'm sure there's some data we'll still be using it for, but yeah. And finally, we have the fully connected layer in this. And that's going to be everything we've seen before. We're going to have a flattening operation that takes these images that we've created from the filters, these activation maps, and flatten them down. And once we do that, we pass that right on to our fully connected layer. And now that it has the image in some sort of neural language that is easy for it to understand, now that the convolutional neural network has changed it to be in this form that it can where it can understand these high-level concepts of the images, what it will be able to do with that information is it's going to be able to now operate upon it and do whatever task it's supposed to be doing, whether that's classification or regression or generation, whatever. The really important part, of course, is that we're doing these convolutions before, but the actual task, the actual classification that's going on, is going to be in these fully connected layers at the end. we're really looking at the convolutional part as almost a translator, translating from image to a neural language. You can think of it as. We don't need many fully connected layers. Usually, once we have the reason that we end up having very large neural nets in the first place is because we are doing a lot of conversion and trying to get the neural network to understand the data. But once it understands the data, and again, I'm using the word understand very loosely here, but once it understands the data, it is pretty easy to do a classification. So that's why usually we only have like 2 or 3 of these at the end. This is a picture of something called VGG19. It's we will actually be using it ourselves in the future. Not in the next lab, but in the one after that, I think. And this is, it's, as you can see, it uses pooling and it uses convolutions. In this case, it has a 3x3 convolution. It actually has 2 of them in a row. It is doing that with 64 filters, so whenever you see depth here, and in these activations, the depth, instead of being the color channels, is going to be the number of filters. The color channels will actually, each channel will end up getting its own filters, its own few filters, but that is included in this depth. So we have 64 filters here. We max pool them to get them the data smaller. We now have another series of convolutions. This one also 3x3, but this time we have 128 filters, 2 convolutions in a row. And we end up with, we can do this max pool again through it. And it keeps going down, and you see this data shrinks as we go, but it also gets deeper. So we usually are going to end up having more and more filters at the end, but they're going to be smaller and smaller because of the pooling. They're going to end up being smaller and smaller outputs, activations, or activation maps. And then finally at the end here, when we have these really tiny little image cards almost, we've pooled them down to 7x7 by 512. At that point, we're finally going to multiply that together to get 4096, I believe, I assume. And flatten those and throw them into this fully connected network, and then it can do whatever classification or object detection or whatever. And that's another thing VGG19 shows is we can string these operations together in different ways. You can do a bunch of convolutions and then one pooling. You could do just convolutions. You can actually have different heads to the network where different fully connected layers are. There's a lot of ways to do these. And in fact, we'll actually get to things called autoencoders, which will have a bottleneck in the data in the middle that actually gets flattened, and then it comes back up the other side and gets bigger again. That is a lecture for another time because it's a very big subject. But and both the convolutions and the pooling are really good because they can phase out the noise and reduce the image size. Both of them do that somewhat. But convolutions are the only ones that actually find the patterns. These are the actual neural net part of the neural net. The poolings are just internal operations that allow us to do a lossy compression. And then the other thing about this, and we're going to get into this much more in the future. It's a very important idea in this, but we're going to just start touching on it now. Deeper layers of a convolutional neural network are going to capture more abstract patterns. So you can think of this like a picture of a car. The earlier layers are might start to capture the texture of the car, the lines that make up the car. Then maybe you get to medium layers, and those are going to be a wheel of a car, or a window of a car, or a headlight of a car. And then finally at the top, you'll get the actual car itself, or a number of cars, different types possibly, depending on how you're training it. But the basic idea here is we have these convolutions, and the earlier ones are capturing these very simple parts of the image, and they're building upon that in a hierarchical way to understand much more larger parts of the image, but in an abstract way. So instead of capturing like a car wheel, it's capturing every car wheel, or it's at least trying to. We will go far more into that in the future, but that's just a touch on that. And here's an example of that sort of thing. So in this case, you see we have just some really low-level lines, and then eventually we get up to... And these, by the way, are the activation maps. That's the fun thing about these convolutional neural nets, is the activation maps that are produced from these are actually images, too, that you can look at. And, you know, we have lines, and then we have kind of larger parts of the car, and then we finally have things like wheels, and sometimes the top of a wheel, or sometimes, for some reason, this honeycomb shape that I don't even know where it came from. But we can get a lot of these. And these specific ones are from a, I forgot which neural network. It might be Google's. But these are classes that these neural nets have learned to identify using their filters. So here's flamingos, and you can see how this would represent a flamingo. It looks like a number of flamingos. Billiard tables, school buses, a beetle on the ground, a black swan, a tricycle. Once we've trained the convolutional neural network on these classes, it's going to learn these filters, or learn the filters to create these activations. And then once these filters understand a particular class or object or whatever, it's going to be able to identify, or it's hopefully going to be able to identify that object in any picture in any position, hopefully. Of course, you know, depending on how it trains, it might end up having one filter for the right side of a flamingo and one for the left side of a flamingo. Who knows? But the important thing is we're encapsulating in these activations, in these filters, the hierarchical traits that create these objects and images. And then real quick before we end, we're going to talk quickly about the hyperparameters that are often associated with convolutional neural nets. So there's three main ones: filter size, stride, and padding. Filter size is pretty simple. That's the size of our filter in our particular convolutional layer. We've seen 3x3, but we can have 4x4 or 5x5 or 3x4, or we even have something called a deformable convolutional neural net, and what that does is it actually creates the shape of the filter by learning it. We're not going to go over that much, I don't think, but that exists. The important thing, though, is we need to make this large enough that it's able to capture the feature, and not large enough that it's going to lead to very big data that we won't be able to process efficiently, or that the neural net won't be able to find patterns in because it just gets bogged down by all the noise and irrelevance. But the important thing about this is it should be enough pixels wide and high that it's going to be able to capture the basic patterns that you're looking for. We have stride. By the way, with filter size, I would almost always start with 3x3 and then go from there. You can try other things if you want, but 3x3 works pretty well. There are other times, like if you know the problem very well and you know, okay, this one, well, the smallest features I want to capture are 5x5 pixels wide, then yeah, I use a 5x5 or a 6x6. But you know, 3x3 is a great place to start. Stride. How far do we move every time we do our convolution? In our previous example, we saw the stride was always 1. Move across 1, and then 1, and then 1 pixel at a time, and then it would move down 1 pixel, and it would do that over and over. But we don't have to do it that way. We can actually save a lot of data if we make the stride a lot bigger. You need to make sure it fits the dimension of the image so that we actually get through the entire image. But otherwise, this can speed up training a lot and make the neural net a lot more efficient in a lot of ways. However, it could also make it not succeed. It might not do as well because it's missing some data, basically. But here's a look at what that actually would mean. In this case, we have a 7x7 input matrix with a stride of 1. Does this one actually? Yeah, okay, cool. So with a stride of 1, we would have a 5x5 output volume as it goes across 1 at a time. With a stride of 2, though, if we go from red to green, and then green to something else, and then that something else to blue, we're only going across 3 at a time, and we're creating a 3x3 output volume. A lot more efficient. You also might be missing stuff, but that's the trade-off we take here. Another thing about stride is, and that's another reason why pooling's kind of going away. You can actually increase the stride and then not do pooling, and often it ends up with a more accurate, faster network. So that's still a new kind of newish, not all that new area of research. But, you know, I would almost, before adding a pooling layer, add some stride in there. Might make your neural network better. And then we have padding. Padding is great. So padding is the idea of adding zeros around our image, adding another square of pixels basically around our image that are all zeroed, so that our either we can use larger strides, or we might want to do something like make sure that our neural net has as much influence on the sides of the image as it does in the middle. And you can see sometimes when people don't do this, because maybe they are training the neural network to like change the style of an image or something. And what it'll end up doing is it'll change the style in the middle really well, but in the sides it doesn't really work. And that can often be because they don't have padding. And the filters are only operating a little bit on the sides and not enough on the on where they should be. Here's an example of that moving across. Or is that doesn't look like an example of padding at all. Ah, there we go. Okay, that was just another picture, I guess. I don't know why I put that one in there. But yeah, here's an example of what that would be if we had a 32x32x3. We would have, we could pad it by, have a padding of 2, and that padding would end up creating this. And that means our filter would be able to go across the entire network or the entire image a lot more easily if it's a 3x3. And to close things off here, CNNs, very powerful, super, super useful. We will be using them heavily. They're really good with understanding images. They're very good at understanding these hierarchies of objects within images. They can be much more efficient when we're dealing with images. They're just really, really good. Awesome application. And the industry reflects this because every practical application of a neural image processing system is going to be using a CNN on some level. It's just the best way to do it with images is to use some form of CNN. And that is it for today. We have some links to go check out if you want to look more into these. I think one of them is, I don't remember which one, goes into the, yeah, here it is, the back propagation. So if you want to take a look at that, you can, but we're not going to be, that is not necessary for this course. And next week, more convnets.